record. Before we start our conversation today, I wanted to just make sure you are aware that for Thursday, the asynchronous piece is a quiz 5, which is a little bit different. Those have typically been due like before we meet on a Tuesday. So just make sure that you have that on your planner, on your plans, that it is due by noon on Thursday, that you take that quiz. So if you won't have time that morning, make sure you carve out time between now and then. And then there's just a PowerPoint. It's a PowerPoint on indirect guidance and the use of space and the environment in helping, guide children's behavior. If you will please make sure that you have read chapter 6 and then review that PowerPoint. I did want to say it's super lengthy in terms of number of slides because most of it is visual. So when you open it and you see 60 slides or whatever, don't have a panic attack. It's mostly just, like I said, photos of classroom environments. But I would like if you would make some notes about things that stand out to you. And then I would like to start our talk on next week on Tuesday with a little bit of reflection on what you learned about use of space and whatnot. Does that make sense? So there's no actual content to turn in for Thursday. Just come prepared for a conversation on Tuesday next week. And I would like to start with maybe just reflecting a little bit on what you did last week on Thursday. So I asked you all to look at that reflection on relationships in your life. If it asked you to list 3 key relationships and then sort of what are the components of those that make them satisfying. If you can just use the chat feature to maybe type out like one word or a couple of words that describe that relationship and what made it impactful in your life. I'd like to use that to start our conversation. Honesty, yeah. It's kind of the cornerstone of any strong and functional relationship, and trust goes along with that. Well-rounded, open communication, unconditional love, dependability, help with difficult tasks, valuing each other in the relationship, transparency that relates back to honesty, making each other feel better in bad times, so support, being there for each other, also sort of a supportive idea.
I'm so sorry, you cut out when you asked the initial question.
Oh,
do you mind repeating that for me?
Yeah, no problem. Just about those relationships that you wrote in the handout, what were some of the characteristics of those relationships? Respect and patience, empathy and understanding, unbiased opinions, open ears, support and empathy. So lots of similar themes coming out of this. And I think that if you expand this to think about our work with young children, we can clearly see how honesty, open communication, there are a lot of these elements, support of one another, respect, patience, all of that, plays into how we work with young children. I recently had an experience with my 7-year-old. She was taking piano lessons in the fall with a woman and doing like a music class as part of our homeschool, kind of an extracurricular. And the teacher unexpectedly passed away over the holiday break.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And it I didn't even know. I sent her a text message that said, can you let me know when piano lessons and music is going to start back up? And I didn't get a response from her. And then I found out secondhand through another mom in the group what had happened. And it was a COVID related death. And anyway, the mom that sent me the message was like, yeah, I'm just telling my kids that music class is canceled. And I felt like, my daughter is 7, but even if she was younger than that, I want to have an honest, open relationship with her where I talk about hard things because life is hard sometimes, and so I just, I use that as an example because I think, that it speaks to my, my philosophy of working with young children is that I believe that children are capable and competent, and I would want that same respect extended to me so that I knew the truth of the situation. And my daughter did have a hard time processing it, but since then, we've had about a month. She has started piano lessons with a new teacher. She has a really nice perspective about honoring what her first teacher taught her and carrying that forward. But, I just think, I think sometimes we do a disservice to children by not being open with them in the way that we could be, because a lot of times they can handle more than we give them credit for. And so along with the relationship piece, I also asked you on those handouts to think about reframing children's behavior. And really all I want to kind of, say to highlight that is just that I think that all behavior is a form of communication, and so even overt, misbehavior is really just a child's way of trying to get our attention, to get something that they need that they don't have the skills to acquire on their own. And so giving children the benefit of the doubt by assuming that when they're taking toys from another child, they're having a struggle with social interactions, or when they're yelling in other people's ear, they might not know how to manage their excitement. These are some ideas that I saw on your all's reframing sheets. But I think that, again, that's not something that's necessarily first nature to us. It's a practice that we have to work with and develop over time. But I think it's so important to building strong relationships with children and helping children be successful in early childhood programs, to practice that when we can. And then another concept, I'm just kind of reviewing what you all should have gone through on your own time on Thursday, was that idea of making deposits. There was let me see if I can give you her name. I don't know it off the top of my head. Does anyone remember her theory that connects our interactions with young children to the idea of a piggy bank? It's kind of an analogy or a metaphor. It'll come up for me in just a second. Anyways, the name is not so important as the idea. But Carolyn Webster Stratton was her name. And that thinking of how do we make deposits to impact children's experience with us, their experience in the classroom, how do we build those relationships? We're going to talk about today some practical strategies for kind of applying that with, first we're going to start with infants and toddlers, and then we'll talk about preschoolers. And then finally, we're going to talk about supporting peer-to-peer relationships in the classroom. And if we have enough time, we'll touch on relationships with families, but we've sort of done some of that already in our times together. So does anyone have anything that they want to speak on before we move on with any of what we just kind of reviewed? Okay. All right. So specifically, when we think about, you guys can see the PowerPoint. When we think about building relationships with infants and toddlers, the very kind of foundation of that is attachment relationships. Attachment relationships, we know, are developed from patterns of interaction between the infants and or toddler and their primary caregiver. And so we see this first and foremost at home. If everybody will check their mute, like I think some people might have some background noise going on. I don't know if I'm able to, let me see. Oh. I'm in this bitch with TB. I'm in this bitch with 4 drink. I just pulled up me a 8. Real nigga all in my face. There we go. Problem solved. Sorry guys, I kind of lost my train of thought. So we know that attachment relationships happen first and foremost at home with the primary caregiver. You know, the mother, father, whomever the infant is interacting with primarily, but these relationships do also show up in the early childhood classroom. I believe in this class, we've talked about the primary care model and what that looks like. I think someone at the CDC mentioned that you guys utilize that model. And that's kind of based on this idea of attachment theory, you know, that that children benefit from having those strong relationships with one or a couple of primary caregivers. And, you know, it's really about helping them feel safe and secure so that they can then move forward in terms of exploring their environment and ultimately, you know, forming other relationships, learning, all of those things. It's based on John Bowlby's work. So he was kind of the person that investigated this initially. And a lot of what we do in our field, you know, sort of stems from this theory. When you see this photo that I've included on the slide, you know, there's things that I notice like eye contact, touch. We talked about those last time. The mother is engaged with the infant and there's probably a back and forth of sound happening between them. Well, maybe not sound at the infant, you know, it was just born, but the mom, I'm sure, is making noises that eventually will be reciprocated by the baby, you know, shared smiles, all of those things that, you know, this is where it all starts. And so as caregivers, when we consistently and lovingly, in the same way that we see this mom in the picture, when we meet the needs of infants and toddlers who are left in our care, they form these secure attachments with us. And as I said, you know, children with secure attachments are better able to develop positive social and emotional skills later on. They also know that they can rely on adults to meet their needs, to respond to them, to comfort them, to help them. A lot of those things that we listed at the beginning of the call in terms of what's important to us in, you know, satisfying relationships, that's what children come to learn about us when we show up for them in a secure attachment relationship. However, if we are unpredictable in our responses, not responsive, if we are insensitive, and then sometimes adults are even threatening or have like a power over kind of dominating approach with children, that can lead to insecure attachments. And insecure attachments negatively impact children's self-concept, their self-esteem, all those things that we talked about last time we met. And, you know, it kind of creates this internalization of feelings of lack of control over their environment, and then, you know, leads to negative outcomes with their social and emotional development. I'm not going to show this video, but do notice that it's in here included if you want to go back and watch. It's an interaction between a mom and a toddler that just sort of gives you a visual of what a parent who is trying to foster a secure attachment with their child, how they might interact with them. Mom is, you know, engaged with the child, talking to her, supporting her when she needs help, and then lets the child kind of do this activity on her own. She's trying to open like a fruit leather, but mom is very excited for her when she's able to do it by herself. And those are all kind of examples of how we might, work to create these types of relationships with children. And I thought that you were seeing that. I apologize, but that's the clip I'm referring to. So I'm not going to read through all of these. I think I've probably touched on them. Acknowledging and responding to a child's needs as soon as possible. I think that one's really important, especially in a group care setting. There's a lot going on in an early childhood classroom, and you can't realistically always meet the child's needs immediately. But I think acknowledging what they, that you hear the need and that you'll be with them as soon as you can, I think that goes a long ways, particularly in a group setting or even at home, even with one child. You can't always drop whatever you're doing to respond, but you can let the child know, I hear you, I see you, I'll be with you when I am able. Our tone of voice is super important. Following children's lead in terms of their play, their interests, supporting them when they're trying to do something on their own, even though it takes a whole lot longer. We want to follow their lead so that we're promoting the best outcomes for them as possible. Reciprocity in interactions. There's a terminology that's being used now. It's called serve and receive, but they use the analogy of like a tennis game. So when a child serves a sound, a smile, some sort of interaction to engage the caregiver, then we want to see this natural back and forth. That's how we teach children about communication norms, conversation, turn taking. All of that stuff starts at this really basic level. And sometimes it's just a responsive smile, to an infant, or a coo back when they make a noise or vocalization. But being aware that there is an intentionality behind engaging with children in that back and forth, even from, birth on. I think this one's really important to mention when we talk about infants and toddlers in particular, is using routines such as diapering, meal times, etc., as an opportunity to interact and engage with children. So often, because in a classroom with 12 children, you're trying to get through 12 diaper changes before nap time, right after lunch. So you've just fed 12 kids, cleaned them up from the table. You're trying to get through this routine, and we just go through the motions. We're not intentional. We're not keying into that time as being an opportunity to engage with a child. And so, I think just being aware that that can happen can help us kind of circumvent that and really pay attention to opportunities to play with children, sing a little song at the diaper changer, whatever the case may be. But that is a way to build strong relationships. And then, I think I'll just point out on this slide, observation and reflection, observing children, and, being really aware of your own feelings, values, beliefs. That's part of why we're doing these reflective activities, in this class, and thinking about some of the things that we're thinking about is how does that, influence how we show up with children and in these types of relationships. And so I think it's a practice of early childhood professionals. We hope to always be lifelong, reflective practitioners, reflective learners. All right. Moving on to thinking about how this can be done in the preschool age with older children. I think I'll start the conversation by sharing this quick video. I told you guys last time, I use a lot of conscious discipline material. And so the fellow that you're going to hear talking, he is kind of a spokesperson for the conscious discipline approach now, because he recognizes how having a teacher he actually had a teacher in high school who was using some of these techniques, and it really like changed his life course. And so he's kind of an advocate for the program now, but I want you to listen to what he has to say about his earliest experience in a preschool setting, and then think about how that kind of ties into what we're talking about here.
Preschool, I got kicked out of preschool. And I can remember, preschool, school was not fun for me. That's when I decided, this school stuff, I don't like it. And you know what my teachers did to me? They kicked me to the side. You know why? Anytime you have something that's hard to deal with or makes you feel uncomfortable, you know what it's easy to do? Get rid of it. Prime example, I've held guns, shot at people, been shot at. Not one time was I afraid. But if anybody come around that corner with a spider, I am gonna show y'all how I move. Spiders, I feel uncomfortable with spiders. Therefore, I push that to the side. They make me feel uncomfortable. I want you to know how important it is in a classroom for you to make your child feel comfortable and not pushed out. So, you know, I got kicked out of preschool. I can remember my grandma coming to get me, and she asked me, boy, how you get kicked out of preschool? And you know, me to a 4-year-old, I'm just, you know, I don't know. But little did I know then, that was the start of a road of destruction.
All right, so some of those statistics that they, you know, project through that video are staggering to me. A third of preschool teachers expel a preschooler. They said, I forgot what the percentage, but you know, significantly more children are expelled from preschool than from public school. And I think part of that is due to the fact that, you know, in the public school system, there is probably more of like an infrastructural protocol. So what we're dealing with in the preschool arena is usually, you know, one program, like their policies and procedures, and there's no kind of overarching body that would say you can't do this in terms of expelling a child. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on, like, why is that happening? Why are children getting expelled from preschool? Or even, and let me just, sorry, Megan, were you going to share?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say too, you know, think about this also, maybe not even just long-term expulsion, but I had a call from a friend earlier last week who had to go pick up her granddaughter from school because the teachers called and said, you know, she's done this, this, and this today, and she needs to be picked up. So what's behind that?
I feel like in preschool, the teachers kind of just assume like, oh, they must just not be ready to be in a school setting. So send them home and like give them more time or something. But in elementary school, it's like they're already there. Like you need them to stay, but preschool, they just like assume that they're too immature to be in a classroom setting.
Yeah, there's probably a big piece of that. And there's also some legality, you know, by 6 or 7 in North Carolina, your child is expected to be enrolled in school. Regardless, you know, and then I think there are probably more behavioral supports and things like that within the school system as well, that, you know, maybe teachers feel a little bit more supported in handling. I mean, I don't know that, but other thoughts on, you know, what's happening for the teacher when they send a child home or remove a child from the preschool setting?
I've interacted with some kids who have pretty like severe like aggression issues when they're upset. And so I feel like that is one thing, like with teachers, like they just like out of like safety for the other kids and also just like trying to deal with it over and over again, it gets to a point where like the teacher's kind of exhausted, and without like seeing a change. And maybe they have tried to do things, or maybe they haven't tried to do things to like change how the kid interacts like with their aggression, but like that's a particularly hard situation.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, you know, all of what you've just pointed out, Grace, is so true. And Sierra put into the chat that maybe they're trying to protect other children from this type of aggression, or from, you know, when you have one child that's just disrupting the whole classroom, it is super challenging. However, what's the message that we send to a child, you know, when we say, you can't be in this classroom anymore?
Essentially just like you're too much to handle,
Too much. Yep.
and like that your needs and like compared to the other children's needs are like, because you're behaving differently to communicate them, like they're not as important and I don't have time to deal with them.
Yep. Yep. And if we relate it back to what DJ Batista, that's the fellow's name that was talking at the beginning of the video. If we relate it back to what he said, it's really at the end of the day, like, I'm uncomfortable with this situation. I don't know how to handle this, you know? So I think at that point, as a classroom teacher, that's where you have to reach out to your administration. You might need to connect with other agencies like the CDSA or, you know, support network in the early childhood community. But I just want to point out how, you know, I mean, this man is an adult who has a history of gang violence, and he relates it back to that initial experience in his preschool where he was expelled, and he sort of internalized that message, I'm not good enough to be here. And I'm sure that that wasn't the intention, but that is sometimes, you know, what could come across. And so I just think, you know, it's really important to make children believe that we love them despite their bad behavior, and find ways to connect with them, because I do truly feel like that can change, you know, those extreme behaviors for children who are typically developing and, you know, maybe don't need the types of additional supports. But even when they do need therapy supports or, you know, other things, relationship is still the foundation of it all. So practical strategies for what we are going to call making deposits at the preschool age. Sometimes it's just as simple as greeting children by their name, valuing children's work, making sure that it is seen in the space and that you are, you know, recognizing when they've worked really hard on something or persisted with a task that was challenging, all of those types of things. Something along the lines of, you know, letting children know, even though today was a rough day, I know tomorrow is going to be better. And I think bringing that mentality into the classroom as the teacher or as the caregiver, every day is a new day. We're going to start fresh. Because I think what happens so often is that, you know, I mean, we certainly don't mean to do it, but we develop these perceptions of children as disruptive or, you know, aggressive, the wild child. And as a classroom teacher, I mean, I can tell you firsthand, there was in almost every group, you know, when you found out so-and-so was going to be sick, homesick that day or not coming, you're like, oh, thank goodness, you know, but when you have that in the back of your mind, like that influences how you show up with that child. It really does. And so finding ways to kind of work around that yourself is so important. Little ways to bring in, you remember we talked about those elements of eye contact, touch, presence, and playfulness. High fives, thumbs up, hugs, those are all examples of kind of how to bring those in, you know, in a really hands-on way. But anytime you can draw on that, I think I mentioned in that recording how sometimes me making a joke about, you know, a child's misbehavior can really just like shift the moment so that it doesn't feel so anymore, you know, and then you're both just kind of playing with it. And that can be a workaround that really helps. When children are absent, telling them how much they were missed. There is a big piece of conscious discipline. It's called the wish you well. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's just basically a practice where you acknowledge who's at school today and who is not. And then for the children who were not able to be there, there's a song, you know, we wish you well today. We wish you well today, all through the day today. We wish you well today. You can sing that song to them. You can hold them in your heart and send, you know, positive vibes or however you want to do it. But I think cultivating a practice like that where we, you know, feel something and acknowledge the part of our community that isn't able to be with us, that helps children feel connected and strong relationships with their adults and peers. Finding time to do individual activities with children, super important when you have, you know, 15 to 18 kids in a preschool classroom. That those one-on-one and small group opportunities are so critical to forming and maintaining relationships. And then just some kind of general all about me ideas. Sometimes you can do this in the form of a book or a poster, but that kind of invites families to be a part of this with their children at home, and then bring something in to share about the child themselves. But it's another way to kind of build that self-esteem, self-efficacy, that type of thing in the classroom. If you guys have spent time at Lucy Brock or in other childcare settings, you've probably seen something like this, where, you know, caregivers are using pictures from the child's home and natural environment to represent the child in the classroom, to place value on the child, and celebrating, you know, things that happened with the child outside of school, another way to build relationships. This is a visual from a child life setting. So I know that not all of us are going into the classroom, and these ideas can be expanded to think about how do we, you know, relate to and form relationships with children in other contexts as well. Acknowledging their birthdays. Basically, you know, at the end of the day, we just want to make it clear to children that we see them as an individual in the group and that we value them as that individual. Thoughts, ideas? Can anyone think of examples of how you've seen this done in other ways? Making relationship deposits. All right, let's think about peer-to-peer relationships then. So obviously these are interactions that take place between or among children. And if these are positive in nature, successful for both children involved, then, you know, this supports children's social and emotional development. There's also research out there that has demonstrated that children who can interact successfully with peers, even during preschool, tend in the long term to be more popular, to have stronger friendships that persist over time, and they are included more often in classroom activities than children who lack these skills. So even in the short term and the long term, you can see how, you know, supporting peer-to-peer interactions has implications for children now and in the future. Sorry, I got somebody talking to me outside the door. All right. So children have a lot of strategies that they use to interact with one another. Some of these are appropriate, some of these are not. I saw a lot of these in your reframing activities where, you know, taking a toy from another child might not be malicious in intent. It might just be a lack of the ability to say, hey, can I play with you? But that, you know, that's kind of an example of how it's our role and our responsibility to teach those skills that we want to see children using so that they can successfully navigate peer interactions. Especially, I saw one on someone's forum, you know, that said maybe they would benefit from having an adult nearby when they're playing with that group of children. And when we know that a child tends to take things rather than asking to play, or, you know, whatever the case may be, we can position ourselves in their space. We can, you know, think of ways where we can support them and sort of teach some of these useful skills that we want to see children using in the classroom. These are all some recommendations for the physical environment, and I think you'll see a lot of these show up in the slides for next time. So I'm not going to spend much time going over those, but again, be aware that they're there if you want to go back and review once we're done. I don't know if you noticed, were you all able to see that there were 2 readings posted to the content for today? So if you read the one that was a required reading, it was about bridging the gender gap. Can anyone share what you took from that? It's about why boys and girls segregate themselves at the preschool age. And if you've spent any time around preschoolers in a group setting, I think you'll see that that kind of tends to naturally happen. So why is that? And then what do we do about it? Let's talk about that for a few minutes. Can anyone share ideas on why this happens?
So like before reading this, I've also kind of learned about it. It's kind of like how kids are making schemes. I think that's the word I'm looking for. In order to like put things into specific categories, like when they're learning about animals versus like specific types of animals, and they're kind of working it into their brains. And there's a period of time when they do not understand that they are like permanently a boy or like permanently a girl in a certain sense. Like sometimes younger boys might think if they grow their hair out, they'll like turn into a girl before that becomes like a concrete thing in their brain. And so in like the preschool setting, they're getting to the age where like they're beginning to learn that like, oh, growing your hair out won't necessarily make you into a girl, but they begin to like see that they are similar to others and that, oh, these are boys or these are girls, and they hang out with one another in order to kind of like they're helping themselves make sense and being able to relate to one another. And there's also the thing of like, typically like younger boys have a lot more energy and like are interested in similar things, and young girls have also a similar, like maybe they don't have as much energy. Obviously these things are very dependent on like individuals, but it's kind of like their way of making sense of who they are and kind of coming into themselves a little bit more.
Yep. So gender schema, and Delaney was talking about schemas in general, but what we're really talking about here is that gender schema that they come to understand, you know, this is what boys do, look like, how they play, all of those ideas. Those are really kind of developing in the preschool years, right? And then, it's a bit of a gender stereotype, but also based on our observations of children, that boys tend to be more rough and tumble, building with blocks, construction, that type of thing, where girls tend to be doing more reading and art. And, so those are all very valid reasons for this kind of phenomenon. Children are also really into the idea of sorting and categorizing because they're developing those schema. And so it might just be kind of a natural extension of that thinking process. But yes, these are kind of the why behind this observation that we tend to see same-sex companions more often than not at the preschool age. So what do we do about it? How can we kind of circumvent that? Ideas here from your reading, your experience, just your own brilliant brains. What do you think?
One thing I learned when I worked in a preschool classroom, the head teacher made sure that each child goes to each station. So instead of letting them choose every time, you make sure that the girls get a chance at the blocks and the guys get a chance at the kitchen area. And she said they'll turn it into they'll make it their own, and it'll still kind of be gendered, but making sure they're introduced to all the different types of activities, so they're not oh, that's a girl thing, that's a boy thing, I can't do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion for kind of breaking down those gender stereotyped ideologies about what play belongs to which gender in the classroom. And I also think you bring out a great point, Megan, that I can remember as a preschool teacher, and I kind of struggled with this because I want to follow the child's lead and I want to make sure that I'm not, overstepping, but at the same time that I'm making sure children get appropriate experiences and that they're having access to all the things they need. But I used to have a little girl who, she would sit and read books 10 hours of the day that we were there. Primarily, even outside, she would sit on the quilt and the materials that we brought outside with us. And so after some conversation with other people at the center and my co-teacher, we decided that we were going to start encouraging her to do other activities and limiting her time with books, because while that is a skill that we want her to have, shared reading and sitting and reading all the time isn't getting you gross motor development skills. It isn't helping you in terms of, creative expression or social interaction. There's a lot of things that are kind of missing from that. And the same could be said for this, very stereotypical gendered play. If you're only ever building in blocks and you don't ever go to the art center, you're missing skills, right? So yeah, I think that's a great idea. What else?
I would say putting the girls and the boys, having different groups. If you're going to have the stations, having that interaction between the both genders, to have them to be able to understand maybe this is how the boys build blocks, but this is how I want to, but also them interacting to understand why each gender does stuff differently as well.
Yeah. And I think that relates to adjusting the environment in a certain sense, as well as that creating an inclusive setting and increasing cooperation and collaboration. And it's another reason why small group experiences in early childhood are so important, because we then get to kind of be the mastermind where we say, I'm going to put these two girls in the space with these two boys. And as Kinsley pointed out, I'm going to let this group of girls learn from this group of boys, how they do it, and then vice versa. But it's again being intentional and thoughtful in how we create play experiences can kind of help reduce this type of segregation that we see happening. And then another thought is to adjust the actual space. So somebody mentioned, we've talked about blocks and art and those type of things. If your block center is on the far right of your classroom and your art center is on the far left of your classroom, and they're naturally segregated boys and girls over here, you might think about how you could move those spaces more close together, or bring some elements of art into the block center, whatever you can think of to kind of mesh the two. But again, if we think about, the environment as a part of the teaching experience for children, and that's a very Reggio principle, but we can probably think about ways that we might adjust the environment to create more peer-to-peer relationship and interaction between boys and girls. So the last piece is positive relationships with families. And again, I've got a few basic just ideas that, I think we all pretty well know that the child's first and primary teacher, the expert on the child is the child's family. And so anything that we as caregivers can do to support our relationship with the child's family, it kind of pays off in dividends in terms of supporting our relationship with the child. Caring for a child also means caring for their families. There is a handout on the course page called, I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it said optional reading, connecting with families, tips for difficult conversations. And it basically outlines these 3 ideas that asking and wondering, active listening, and empathizing are ways that we can make deposits with families, right? So asking and wondering, that kind of relates back to what we talked about at the end of the last class or at the beginning of this call, in that idea of reframing, so if I have a mom who has missed 2 parent-teacher conferences that we've scheduled, and, I haven't seen her in 3 weeks to pick up her child, I can assume that she's blowing us off and, doesn't have time to be a part of her child's education or whatever. Or I could ask and wonder what in the world is going on with this family that is keeping this mom from being able to be part of her child's educational experience right now. And there's a difference there in my perception of the mom. There's going to be a difference in how I relate to the mom, just based on that simple shift in my thinking, where I'm assuming or I'm asking and wondering what is going on. Another strategy is active listening. Does anyone know what the skill of active listening looks like or feels like, and would be willing to explain it to us?
That just like when you like nod and show that you're listening, like you're locked in kind of thing.
That's a part of it. I think, visual cues and things like that. There's it's like a practice in psychology though. And I actually took a psychology class a long time ago where they made us sort of practice this. A lot of times you might come across this in like relationship therapy or something like that. But the active piece also comes in when it's basically, if I hear you say something, then I try to restate that back to you in like a way that shows that I understood it. So you might say something like, what I heard you say was, and then you kind of rephrase back what the mom just shared with you or whatever. But that, number one, shows that you were engaged and, heard what was said. And number 2, when you kind of parrot it back to the family member, it gives them an opportunity to clarify if you misunderstood or, didn't get their point across. And so, it's just it's a way to really kind of deepen the communication with families. And it can lead to a better empathic response, when we do both of these things, when we're open to asking and wondering about, what's happening with children or families, and actively listening to what they're sharing with us, then we empathize with their circumstances, and just relate to them on a deeper level. Again, there are some practical strategies outlined here. I'm not going to read through those, but I think open lines of communication is kind of the bottom line. You know, we need that with families, especially now that families are not as present in our classrooms. That's become even more important, I think, to find new ways and I don't know, different ways, I guess, to keep those lines of communication as open as we can. And then it is important to consider when there might be possible risk factors affecting families. So poverty, non-flexible work situations. You know, when I mentioned the mom that doesn't come to pick her child up or isn't coming to parent-teacher conferences, that might just be a function of her life circumstances, that she's working in the evening and my schedule of availability doesn't work or match up with hers. And so, you know, being thoughtful to how we can kind of work around those types of challenges can help to engage families. Sometimes it's lack of support, lack of a social network. So, you know, if mom's a single mom and doesn't have anyone else, you know, that can limit their availability to be involved or to, you know, be part of their child's educational experience. And then of course, there are sometimes issues of substance abuse, domestic violence, things like that, that we need to be cognizant of. Maternal depression is another. So, you know, just being aware that this could happen and kind of knowing red flags to look for. Maternal depression impacts the mother's ability to bond with their child. It can impact that attachment relationship. And it has also been linked to children's reduced language ability. So, you know, there are implications for outcomes for children if maternal depression is a factor. Things we can do if we suspect that that might be happening, providing information, resource and referral to help with tapping into supports. Again, open communication with parents about, you know, where they're at, what their feelings are, that type of thing. Letting people know if you're concerned, doing those active listening skills, avoiding judgment. I think that's kind of a cornerstone of work with children and families, is avoiding judgment anytime we see that we're doing that. And then, you know, asking how we as a program can be supportive. And that brings us to the conclusion of our talk on relationships. So again, for next time, you will need to review the PowerPoint on indirect guidance as it relates to space and the classroom environment. There's also a resource posted to the course page called Take a Look into Our Classroom. I would like for you to look that over and then share your thoughts on that. Yes, and if you'll type your name into the chat as people are doing right now, I appreciate it. And please don't forget about quiz 5 coming up due, as I said, before noon on Thursday. Any questions?
Professor Carter, I don't know if it was like, if it has already been fixed, but when I went on yesterday, it said that the quiz was due next Thursday, quiz 5.
Okay.
Just so you know,
Thank
that's
you
what it
so
said on
much.
As You Learn.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. I will take a look at it when we get off the call here.
Quiz 5 will be based on chapter 6 like usual, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, chapter 6, the indirect guidance piece. Any other questions? All right, so yeah, take some notes and come prepared to talk about environments and indirect guidance next time. Thank you. Y'all have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
I'll
you.
see you Tuesday.
Have a good week.
Thank you. You too.